My name is Omniglot and I'm a native language teacher or a mother tongue teacher here at Omniglot. I teach Icelandic, and today it's my pleasure to talk to you about why writing is one of the most important skills that we can help foster within our students. I want to begin this lecture today by talking to you about handwriting. Now, handwriting, somewhat intuitively enough, is the skill of writing something down on a piece of paper with a pen or pencil. And over the last couple of decades, deliberate focus on handwriting instruction at the elementary school level has decreased substantially. Now, this is in large part due to the immense technological advancements that have been made during this time, and we can see this by noting the great proportion of students that have ready access to a computer during their lectures. However, to not explicitly encourage our students to focus on acquiring the skill of handwriting successfully is somewhat short-sighted because handwriting is associated with a vast number of positive outcomes. For example, handwriting is a good predictor of reading proficiency. Handwriting is a good predictor of writing proficiency and writing development. Handwriting is also a good predictor of efficient abstraction during lectures. Now, what I mean by that is that a student that has mastered the skill of handwriting is able to abstract the gist of what is being lectured to them, or to put it differently, they're better able to grasp the content of a lecture as a whole and subsequently summarize its constituent elements into a coherent set of ideas. Now, some studies have shown that students that master the skill of handwriting are better able to produce writing samples that are simultaneously longer and of a higher quality than students that have not mastered handwriting. Their fluency of language is also markedly better, and by contrast, the insufficient mastery over handwriting has a debilitating effect on a student's ability to take notes during lectures, assuming that taking notes is something that the student should be doing or could be doing. And this is because when a student has not successfully acquired the skill of handwriting in a manner that makes handwriting an automatic process, they're forced to attempt to focus on two things simultaneously. They must attend to what is being lectured to them and try to focus their attentional capacities towards that, but they must also focus on what they're trying to note down. And when you try to do these two tasks simultaneously, you diverge your attentional resources, and this appears to lead to insufficiencies in both their notes and in their focal attentive process on, or focal attention on the lecture. Now, there are even some studies that suggest that not successfully acquiring handwriting at an early age has a debilitating effect on student academic career, or more specifically, on their academic achievement. These effects are noticeable throughout their entire time in which they are employed at school or enrolled in a school. So we must do our best to try to make sure that the students have sufficient mastery over handwriting. Now, I want to point your attention to some of the benefits associated with handwriting above and beyond what I've already mentioned. As I alluded to before, handwriting is a good predictor of reading and writing proficiency or literacy for all intents and purposes. And there is evidence to support that up to 18% of the variation in reading proficiency is explained by successfully acquiring the skill of handwriting. That is the same thing as saying 18% of the reason for a student's ability to read is the result of their ability to handwrite. And now to put this in some sort of context, the average psychological study is able to account for 4% of the variation between two measured constructs, assuming one of them is psychological. And in comparison, 18% is a huge effect. Now, the main topic of our discussion today is about the importance of encouraging our students to write. But one might ask, why should anyone bother with writing? That's a good question. Here's one way to think of it. Learning to write is the same thing as learning to formulate and organize an informed, coherent, and sophisticated set of ideas about something important. Something important about something important by your own definition of what is important. Or to put it even more simply, writing is the same thing as organizing your thoughts. Learning to read and write helps us place our thoughts into like a narrative framework, and writing is associated with a plethora of psychological benefits. Writing extends your memory, facilitates critical examination of your ideas, and it clarifies your thoughts. When writing is nested in a narrative framework, we're essentially creating a fictional story on the page, and we can then engage with that fictional story. We can try to we can try to play out our ideas. We can try out new ideas, and by doing so, either cognitively or on the page, there are no real world, no real calculable consequences for the person because we're acting out an idea, we're letting it play out. What is interesting about fictional stories is that when we engage in them, in fictional stories, it helps to prepare us for challenging real world situations, increases our empathy and theory of mind skills, and it also improves our emotional competencies. Now, another reason for learning how to write is associated with all of the different demands of modern societies. For example, when we apply for a job, we must make our case in a personal letter, and if we want a raise, we must convince our boss that we deserve it. What is interesting is that the person who can formulate and communicate their ideas in the most coherent, structured, and sophisticated way always comes out on top in situations which involve negotiations. Because if you're trying to convince somebody of the validity of your idea, you have to debate its merits successfully, particularly if there are other competing ideas. By the same token, if we want to engage in political discussions, we must be able to formulate a coherent train of thought, something that is particularly important when we want to inspect our own ideological presuppositions. But the question of what to write about remains. Well, first of all, you should write about something that excites you, something that you want to know more about. And then you should formulate a question around that topic that you want to know the answer to. Then you simply just answer that question. By answering a question that you're curious about, you're making the task of writing exciting as opposed to being a dull and daunting thing you're supposed to do. This sort of frame of reference also helps to organize and direct your thoughts. So you're engaging in a goal-directed process, and the goal is to answer the question that excites you, the question that you're curious about. When you do this correctly, you can become so curious about your topic and excited that you just hardly can't stand it. You'll read more extra material to understand the topic better, and you'll spend way more time crafting the document that holds the text. Because you're operating within this goal-directed frame. You're curious. You approach it from a different point of reference. Writing all of a sudden becomes something that you get to do, not something that you have to do. A couple of things are important to keep in mind when writing. First of all, most people attempt to produce the perfect text document in the beginning. And as such, they're trying to both produce text and edit it simultaneously. Now, we've already alluded to how what could happen when you diverge your attentional resources between two tasks. And the long and short of it is that it leads to insufficiencies in both tasks. And it's interesting to note that text production and text editing are governed by different areas of the brain. The left hemisphere is preferentially associated with producing text, while the right hemisphere is preferentially associated with text editing. Now, there is considerable evidence that suggests that the left hemisphere is biased towards information processing that is associated with approaching something, so like a goal, and is also associated with positive emotions. Now, and by the same token, the right hemisphere appears to be preferentially biased towards information processing of negative emotions. So, in effect, what you're truly doing when you're trying to both edit and produce text at the same time, it's like you're trying to push and pull on a door at the same time. The result is that neither task is successfully finished, and you're more likely to burn out and use up all of your motivation because it's cognitively demanding trying to do two opposite things at the same time. So, produce the text first, edit it later. And when you're producing a text, it's incalculably important to produce a draft. Make it a bad draft, because having a bad draft is so much better than having no draft. A draft can be edited and it can be made better, but you cannot really edit an abstract, unformulated idea. Editing your text is as important as producing it. And much of what you write down initially is going to be garbage, but you can edit it and make it into something that is sophisticated and coherent by cutting the parts of it that are irrelevant. And you don't know which parts are irrelevant until after you have already written everything down. That's why it's beneficial to aim at a bad draft, because you can edit it and make it longer than your final document is going to be. Make it about 25% longer. And then you'll have ample opportunities to intelligently organize your thoughts on the page. But before you write that draft, roughly outline the intended result. Now, making an outline is non-negotiable. It clarifies your process and it guides your process. For example, write down the name of the chapters and then make bullet points that roughly contain each of the paragraph and what it's supposed to contain. And remember to use your question as a sort of guiding principle throughout the entire process. Try it out and you'll be amazed at the quality increases of your texts and of your student texts. When you have outlined and drafted your text, then you can edit it. Now, when you edit a text, you must pay attention to all the different levels of analyses that the text needs editing on. You must make sure that each and every word in a sentence makes coherent sense for that sentence. You must make sure that the sentences within each paragraph are logically connected and all get at the same idea. You must make sure that the paragraphs all flow logically from one another and there's a narrative red thread that runs through them. You must also make sure that the subchapters within each chapter are structured in a manner that logically and coherently connects to both your question and the topic of that chapter. But you must also make sure that the chapters are presented in a logical order. Editing, again, needs to be done at each and every level of analysis, and together they make a holistic body of text. I want to wrap our discussion up today by providing you with a couple of practical examples on how we can apply all of these principles in our mother tongue lectures. And what is most important is that we educate our students on why it's important to write. Now, we've already discussed this at length, why it's important. But if you're only going to remember one thing from today's lecture, then just remember that writing is organized thinking. And adding to that, we can think of, it was Alfred North Whitehead who said that the purpose of thinking is to let your ideas die instead of you. And that essentially means that when we organize our thoughts, right, we're better able to cope with the challenging events that we will run into in our lives because we've already organized our thoughts and we've let them play out and battle out to see what the possible consequences of engaging in them further are. We're not acting as carelessly. Now, apart from informing our students on the importance of writing, we can help them formulate a topic question in those instances where we assign essays. And we can also engage in guided discussions about their topic beforehand, and we can also help them edit their texts. For example, we can allow them to submit the same essay multiple times, but provide them with feedback every time, and then they learn how to edit texts, because as we already discussed, it's as important to learn how to edit as it is to learn how to write. We should also strive to encourage our students to read as much as possible. We can even help them to construct reading lists, whether it be books, articles, web pages, name it. To give you a more concrete example of how these principles look in application, I want to tell you about an instance in which I asked one of my students' opinion about daylight savings. This was just before the clock was going to move forward. She was not happy about it. Now, after a short discussion, I asked her to write two alternate texts, one that argued for daylight savings, but another that opposed it. After she had done that, I asked her again about her opinion about daylight savings. And what was interesting that not only were her thoughts more organized and her opinion better grounded, both by my estimation and also hers, but she also had a greater appreciation for the counter argument that maybe daylight savings wasn't all bad. Some of it was bad, and fair enough. But this increased ability to take the other perspective was smart. This slide contains a summary of the key components that we've been discussing today, but in Swedish. Feel free to pause the video if you want to read it. But apart from that, it is time to wrap this lecture up. It's been an honor partaking in this seminar series for teachers by teachers. Thank you for your attention and your interest in making the school